from?
You want the beginning?
Yeah, just a little background.
Am I on now, or?
For him, yeah.
For me.
Oh, okay. I was born in Saarbrücken, which is the capital of the Saar Basin, and now Germany. At the time I was born, it was under a mandate of the League of Nations, and then they had a referendum in 1933, and they voted to become German. So as a Jewish family, we emigrated to Luxembourg in 1935, and then left Luxembourg for the United States in 38. And I grew up in New York.
And you were basically out before the war started.
Yes. Yeah. We left in October 38, and the war began a year later in September.
What brings you here, first of all?
To Jamestown?
Well, I guess you were giving a presentation last night, am I correct on that?
No, I'm giving it today.
Giving it today,
At
okay.
the Holocaust Memorial for the Holocaust Commemoration Committee. And then tomorrow I'll be speaking to some students in Dunkirk, high school students, about the same subject.
What is it you have to say?
I had a special role in Nuremberg. I worked at the prison as a member of a security detachment, and I was one of 4 people who censored mail going in and out of the prison, so that I had access to letters coming to and from people like Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop. And my presentation will be based primarily on some of the gleanings I have from those letters.
Interesting. I bet you saw the gamut of writings, reflections, information.
Well, one of the strangest parts is these people were really quite different, but what they share is a kind of ironic double-think, where what they were accused of, the atrocities most of them were accused of, are in total contrast to the warmth and love that they demonstrated toward their families, and which were reciprocated. And that's the gist of my address.
You've obviously had the chance to reflect and take a look at the photos and what's here at the Jackson Center. Quite obviously, Justice Jackson, in his role as prosecutor over there, was one of the first people really to bring out the atrocities that occurred in part with the Holocaust and what happened to the German people. Your thoughts about this center and what it means?
Well, of course, I think Justice Jackson was the moving force behind the International Military Tribunal, getting it going, which wasn't done overnight. There were meetings in London, there were preparations in Luxembourg. There were all sorts of plans which didn't work out, and when it was finally settled, I think most of the credit, if you will go to Justice Jackson. But his particular interest in these trials was count 1, which was aggressive war, labeling aggressive war as a crime. That was what he was concerned with most. Now, the other counts, and there were 4, crimes against peace, were handled by the English. And then the last 2, war crimes and crimes against humanity, were handled by the Russians and the French. Now, the latter ones sound much more serious, and in many ways they are, but I guess speaking from a legal point of view, Jackson thought the aggression, the conspiracy, was the more cutting-edge issue. Now, this is doesn't come from me. It's a recent article by a man named Kenneth Anderson, who was a true expert in this area. That's what I've just said comes from him.
Okay. Your thoughts about the center, what you've seen here that's put together as a
I knew
furniture.
the center existed because I met Mr. Peterson some time ago, and he's talked about it, but I had no idea it was so luxurious and so vast and so well developed and so much going on here. I'm really impressed. And,
what are your recollections of Justice Jackson, the type of person that he was, the type of person that was prosecuting also at Nuremberg?
well, of course, I never met Justice Jackson. I was a private. Justice Jackson was slightly above me, even though he was not in the service. But my job was primarily working in an office. I had a pass to go to the courtroom whenever I wanted, but I did not go that often because it's well known that the trial was not terribly exciting, partly because of Justice Jackson. Instead of depending primarily on witnesses, they depended on documents. So going to the courtroom meant you watched people shuffle documents. And the kind of scenes we just saw on the video here, where Jackson is interviewing people like Goring and Schacht, those were relatively rare. But 10 months of it was primarily paper shuffling.
You were a private in which branch of the service?
Army.
The Army.
Yeah, I was trained as an infantry reserve to go to the Pacific, but when the war ended, they shipped me over there, found out I knew some German, and had this job for me at the trials.
Was there any particular aspect of the trial or the work that you did over there that stood out to you? I know you mentioned there was a lot of paper shuffling and so on.
Well,
there
that's
must have been some
Sure.
interesting memories from.
Of course.
That.
That was in the courtroom. There were exciting moments in the courtroom for which the press assembled. You know, the verdict, for instance, the interrogation of some of the major prisoners. But to me, it was the day in, day out routine of working in occupied Germany, of watching Germans who, while they didn't like us, much preferred us to the other occupying nations, especially the Russians, so that there was an exodus from the Russian zone to the American zone. As I make clear in my talk, I was 18, I was an immigrant, I suffered personal losses, so that I was not kindly disposed toward the Germans in their plight. Those are memories. Then there were memories of Nuremberg, which is a historic city, but at the time it was the old part of the city. The historic part was totally in ruins, and nothing was being done, and nothing happened until 1948, after I had left.
I was wondering, you had talked about leaving Germany and coming here. What was it like going back?
Rather exciting and kind of a surprise, because here I was, an adolescent immigrant boy, most of whose family had been exterminated, and here I was not only going back to Germany, but going to the trials. So I can't say I felt it was a feather in my cap, but it was a privileged position to observe things from that vantage point. And I learned a lot, and I evolved a lot, and in the intervening years, I'm still evolving.
How so?
Well, at the time, I was like the Russians, like Churchill. I thought these people should be hanged or shot or done away with immediately, and not just these people, but the generic group called Germans. And as the years passed, and I got a little older and a little wiser, and went to college and read some people who really knew how to think, I developed a more magnanimous attitude. I'm against the death penalty. Although, as I point out in my talk, I haven't forgiven anyone, because I think forgiving is really not is a God-like endeavor. And besides, no one's asked me for forgiveness. No, I haven't forgotten either. And in these days, people should remember, because there's no end to it. And I hope talks like mine and what the Jackson Center is doing in part will somehow, if not eliminate, but somehow mitigate and make less frequent these scourges of killing.
Just for information, Doctor, where are you from, and are you an author?
No, no, no. I have, this talk, I've given it about 4 times. Sometimes people tell me to write it out, and my response is that there's altogether too much writing going on out there. So I'll talk once in a while, but I'm not an author now. I'm a retired professor of French.
French?
Yes.
Interesting.
The German, at the time I decided on a major, German really wasn't very palatable. In the meantime, I've made my peace with not Goering, Goethe. Terrible slip there. Goethe and Schiller and people do something with German.
Okay. And I'm all set. Doctor, it was indeed a pleasure.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Hope it's helpful. Now, what happens to all this?
What's that?
What happens to it?
It goes and I use excerpts of it for stories that we put on the air on the radio station. WJTN here in Jamestown. And it's been interesting covering the people and talking to the people that come here. We're looking forward to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court coming, obviously. And,
Sure.
he was a law clerk for Justice Jackson. I forget what years he was with him.
Fifth terms, 1951 term, and 1952 term, so he was there for 2 terms. Just a quick vignette. As I mentioned last night at dinner, this is a Swedish and an Italian community, principally. And Rehnquist hopefully will tell a story, if not publicly, hopefully during the course of our very limited interview. I'll tell you, Terry, and I'll tell all the media there. He's not given access to any media interviews. However, he is hopefully, knock on wood, going to give John Barrett and me a chance to interview him for a few minutes. So hopefully one of the 2 times he'll talk about this one story, and the story is Phil Neal, who was here in October, one of his former clerks in the 40s, was a professor of constitutional law at Stanford. And there, Neal had asked Jackson to come out and to dedicate the Stanford Law School. So Jackson accepted. And as plans were being made, Neal had in his class this bright young student named Rehnquist, and asked Rehnquist if he would be interested in interviewing with Jackson. Rehnquist said, hey, why not? So they set up this appointment, and there Rehnquist had done what any other student of law is going to do, is read like hell every constitutional law case you can. Be prepared when you get asked by a justice of the Supreme Court the questions, to see that you have this knowledge base. Well, as would have it, the moment of truth came. In walks Rehnquist, Jackson, they shake hands, the normal banalities, and Jackson looks at Rehnquist and says, Rehnquist, isn't that Swedish? He goes, yeah, it is. Well, sit down, let me tell you about all my Swedish clients in Jamestown. And so for the next half hour, Jackson regales Rehnquist with Swedish stories. And then time is up because I guess that's it. Nice to meet you. Rehnquist never had one question asked of him concerning any knowledge that he had prepared for that half-hour interview. So needless to say, Rehnquist walks out thinking it was a complete bust. All Jackson was filling in the time. Well, unbeknownst to anybody, his current clerk at the time, Niebank, had been given a notice to be drafted into the Korean War. And so Jackson was a little panicked and needed to get somebody, so the last guy he had interviewed was Rehnquist. And that's how history was made. At no point did Rehnquist showcase himself to Justice Jackson.
That's how lives are determined.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the rest they say is history. I'm going to flip over into that side there, and then
I'll get out.
Well, now, this year she's having way too much fun, which makes me worried, Dad, this is the greatest spot.
That happens.
Now, I'm going to pick up on, we had a great interview probably about a year ago at this time. And one of the areas which I did not at all have a chance to talk about was after the IMT was over, did you come back to the States?
Yes, I was discharged and went back to New York and trying to find a career for myself, but at the same time applied to return to Nuremberg as a civilian employee. And after giving up and working in Gimbel's basement, I got the call. And they, almost overnight, I had to get ready. And they gave me an exam to me and to 12 others, which consisted of translating something in Time magazine. And of course I passed. Well, they flew us over. It took about 4 days to fly over, but DC-4, I think it was. We landed in Bermuda, in the Azores, in Paris, in Frankfurt. Finally made it to Nuremberg. They gave us another test. This time, the German legal code, the Reichsgesetzblatt. And 13 translators flunked. So they were going to ship us back. Some did go back. I was assigned to a new position with the same old detachment I had been with, but my job was to organize and make possible meetings between clients and lawyers, the defense counsels and their clients and witnesses. So I did that for a year and a half.
How did that work? So, for example, there were 12 subsequent trials, and you were basically assigned and paid by the United States government
Yes.
to work with the attorneys, the German attorneys,
Right.
who were the defense counsel. Were you assigned to specific cases, or
No,
just,
no,
generally a
no.
pool?
No, had an office with an assistant, and the counsels would come in and ask to make appointments to see this or that client, and I would arrange that with people in the prison. They would bring the individual up, and they would have an interview. And the place of interview, there's a picture of it right over there. There was a kind of a grill between them. If documents had to be passed, that was at the end of the hallway. But I had very little to do with the prisoners. I had 2 companies of Baltic guards under me. They did the actual supervising.
Did you have, were you aware of who you were bringing to them, to the defense counsel? I mean, as far as what their background
Oh,
was
yes,
to the
yeah.
prisoners?
Now, I wasn't there for all those trials. There were some concentration camp commandants. There were the physicians. When I got there, I worked for about a month translating on the Flick cartel. And of course, I.G. Farben was also on trial.
Right.
But my memory is quite vague on those days. I couldn't mention specific prisoners anymore. Well, maybe a few, but
I just happened to locate it in the back of Whitney Harris's book, Tyranny on Trial. They do mention briefly some of those extra trials, and one of them was the Flick case, which sought to charge 6 defendants who were leading officials in the Flick concern and with criminal conduct relative to slave labor, the spoliation of property in occupied France and the Soviet Union, and the Aryanization of the Jewish industrial and mining properties. Did you have any reason to go to the courtroom at all, or to any of those?
I'm sure I went a few times, but again, not very often. Because it was, remember, I was 18, the highly educated graduate of the Manhattan High School of Aviation Trades, so that my legal background and sophistication wasn't that high.
Right.
And like most GIs, private, after a while, my main concern was my daily life, my free hours, cruising around Nuremberg, being with friends.
When you just came back, I'm going to hold on just a second to try to fix this. So you know, Debbie, what's going on. I'm not sure what happened here, but the tape went a little bonkers. Technology. It's good Good thing Debbie's here, that's why she's protecting me. Okay, there we go. When you came back from the IMT, prior to going back to Nuremberg, were people curious about your job?
Oh, yes. Especially my relatives. Very curious.
What did they ask? What was...
Well, they asked about my meetings with some of the major accused, convicted. They also asked me about the German people. While there, I had occasion to go back through my hometowns, Upperkin. I somehow got to be on a convoy to go to Luxembourg to pick up German prisoners of war who came to Nuremberg to work in the prison. So I got to see my hometown, which I was delighted to see in rubble. And to this day, I have no real affection for the place. I was just there last year. It meant nothing to me and my brother. And also to go to Luxembourg, where I had lived. And that's where I found my cousin Henry, who lived in Buffalo for 50 years and just passed away last year. And he was a survivor of not just Auschwitz and the Lodz Ghetto, but also Bergen-Belsen. So that was probably my most dramatic moment.
Right, right. When they asked you about what the defendants were like, what did you tell them?
Well, I talked about the individual characteristics. Goring was the strongest, the most intelligent, the most perseverant in maintaining some kind of defense. Hess had amnesia and was crazy, or at least pretended to be most of the time. Stryker was an animal, not just according to me, but according to his co-defendants, which surprised no one, and so on. And then, of course, the conditions in the prison, how they lived, how they were cared for, and they were cared for. And then these excerpts from letters, which I'll share this afternoon.
On the letters themselves, were you required to, after you did your translation, what was the procedure? How did that work? You got the original letter in German?
Oh, no, what I did, I got the original letter in German, and I copied some parts of them, and sent those home. I sent them home. And then much later, when I was asked to start speaking about it, I translated them. They're not difficult to translate because letter writing is, for most people, is not really an art. That people talk about very pedestrian things and you can anticipate what they'll say. The one thing I had difficulty with was the old German script, which I've never learned to read. I can decipher some, but we had one person who was a little older and who handled all that.
You mentioned that there was 4 altogether. Was there a pecking order? Was he the sort of in charge of the 3 of you?
Well, not really, but by age, he was the most experienced. A fellow named Bailey. And the other 2 and I were really just 18-year-olds, recruits.
Did you chum around together, or did you kind of do your separate thing?
We chummed around to some extent, but I also had friends who were roommates, and we lived in a semi-bombed out building across the street from the courthouse.
Right.
And we had an enlisted men's club also on the street. I didn't spend that much time there, but the veterans spent a lot of time in there with German girls.
Right.
And they couldn't speak German. The girls couldn't speak English. And I always wondered how they could sit there and talk for hours on end, which they did.
And of course, the means of exchange at the time was the cigarette, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
primary. Yeah. Also coffee, chocolate, nylons, but cigarettes really was money.
Right. How did you get those? Was the
PX. Yeah, we were allotted, I think, a carton a week. Unfortunately, at the time I smoked, so I couldn't just use them all. But there were people who did very well, some people who knew diamonds and bought diamonds. I had some suits made, and bought some china, and which I still have. And I bought well, this was later when I was a civilian. I bought a bicycle, my first bicycle, carton of cigarettes.
All right. Great means of exchange.
Yeah.
As you reflect back on that period of time in your life, you are 18 years old, your family, except for your mother and brother and some cousins, were victims of the Holocaust. Were you aware of that at the time? I mean, during the IMT trial, were you aware of what happened to the rest of your family?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. By that time we knew. Now, I don't know if we had the documentation at that point. My grandmother and my aunts and cousins were exterminated in Theresienstadt. And we knew they were gone. But I don't know if at that point we had the documentation. Since then, we have it, of course. My aunt's husbands disappeared without a trace. Then there were other relatives, one family, an uncle, aunt, 3 cousins. The 2 boys somehow tried to escape to Spain, were caught, and then sent to Buchenwald, but as Frenchmen. So they survived. Their sister, who now lives in Waukegan, was hidden, first by a family, then by the nuns in southern France. And the parents were hidden in a room for 2 years. And they all survived. And eventually came to the States.
Wow.
And then there's the cousin in Buffalo. But those are the only ones.
You mentioned that you've had a chance to be interviewed by the Shoah
Yes.
Foundation, as well as your cousin who just recently died, Henry. Were your aunts also interviewed?
No, my aunts didn't make it. The one aunt, no. She died before they started making those videos. Now, there was my cousin Henry, who was a survivor of the camps. There's my cousin Alice, who was a hidden child, as they called her. There was her husband, who came from the same hometown, who somehow got to France, escaped a roundup, and then joined the Free French. And he died a few years ago. So they all have tapes. And my tape, which is really quite different, for a family saga, if somebody ever wants to edit those things, I think it might be interesting, because all the experiences are quite different.
Right. There you go, Debbie. Do you have, when you watch, or do you watch the History Channel, and when they recount some of the experiences of the Holocaust?
I try to avoid it. I try to avoid reading books concerning this. When I schedule to give this talk, which I don't do very often, I do it reluctantly, then I start reading a little bit. And what hurts the most is that every time I do, I find out it was even worse than I thought. So I don't do it very often.
Do you see the value of it, though?
Yes, that's why I do it. As I say, I don't have great hopes for putting an end to atrocities and idiocy and so on, but just a little bit. I do believe that if you're patient enough, if you have several lifetimes, you can actually see some moral progress in the human race. And in preparing for this, I read about the beginnings of the Red Cross, which was really sort of the first attempt at helping soldiers wounded and dying on the battlefield. And it goes back to 1859, when the French slaughtered the Austrians at Solferino. A Swiss named Henri Durand helped them. It also began to take shape during the Civil War. There was some concern for the wounded. But that eventually led to the formation of the Red Cross, first real NGO, and now we have quite a bit more. So, as I say, if you have a couple of centuries, you might actually see some progress. But I'm too old and too experienced to expect these things to end. I mean, Iraq is just the latest.
Yeah.
And then there's Rwanda and Bosnia and Cambodia. Cambodia, they're finally going to have a trial, maybe. Have you read about that? No. But that's Hun Sen, the prime minister, is in charge, and he may change his mind or do nothing. And still, people like me say, you have to keep trying.
What's next for Arnold Joseph? Here you are, retired 13 years from Denison.
Well, 11. 11, yeah. No, I try to stay intellectually alive, if not terribly active, and physically fit. So I spend an hour a day running or exercising or something like that. And then I once in a while I teach a course. Not a course, but help some seniors who are even more senile than I am through the reading of a book. Give a talk here and there, not necessarily on this topic. And then travel a little bit. Go to France a couple of times a year, ride my bicycle. So it's, I don't accomplish a thing. I don't believe in accomplishing anything. But I'm enjoying it.
Well, you have accomplished much, and you'll be accomplishing some more by the end of tomorrow at this time, because you will have imparted your experience to several people.
Tomorrow's the real challenge. Teenagers. I haven't really talked to one in 30 years.
You can try him.
Yeah, maybe you could help me out.
Try.
Yeah, but you don't even dress funny. I mean, your pants seem to be staying up.
Yeah. I just, good luck with that, I guess.
Deb, you've listened to this. Do you have any questions? I know there's
Not anything specific, it's interesting you're giving a talk on the Holocaust. My daughter's 8th grade class is doing research papers on the Holocaust right now. They're starting to ramp up their research. It's just really interesting.
Yeah, there's
Listen
quite a
to
bit
what
of that
they
going
do.
on. I'm very much interested in not just defining it as something that happened to Jews in Germany, because it happens all over. Germans had some very special additions to the process, but inhumanity doesn't go away.
when you think about some of the actual defendants themselves, and maybe for the benefit of the tape, you did have one experience where you were delivering mail and you happened to run into the number one defendant there.
Yeah, there was a passage built by the Americans which led from the prison to the Palace of Justice, the courtroom. And one day I was delivering the mail to the prison. I was in that passageway, and coming the other way was Goring, followed by a guard. And the passageway was only about 4 feet wide, so I instinctively stepped aside. I don't know why, I didn't have a chance to think about it, but he was an imposing man. He was walking fast, and I was sort of in the dream world. But I resented that. I still resent that, the fact that I was intimidated by this man. But I was.
Did you have any chance to interface with any of the other defendants?
Yes, a little bit, but menial little things. For instance, our detachment had taken their immediate belongings when they were arrested. There was a storage room, and sometimes one of the officers might have to talk to them about things of that sort. They took me along to interpret, but that's about it.
Ernst Kaltenbrunner, I'm looking at a picture of him right now,
Mhm.
and he had that big scar on his face. I mean, that had to be an imposing,
Well, he was tall, but he was hardly imposing at this point. He was no longer wearing a uniform, and by this time he was a stooped, elderly man. Just really quite different from Goring, who physically was not as imposing. He was terribly obese, lost 50 pounds while in prison, but he had his shoulders back and his head up, whereas Kaltenbrunner, one of the worst of the criminals, was already stooped and tired looking, and obviously aware of what happened to him.
what about Stryker?
Stryker, as I say, was not only repugnant to just about everyone in the world, but even to his co-defendants who didn't feel he belonged with them. One, he wasn't terribly important. He made a lot of noise, said a lot of horrible things, but he was provably stupid and crude, vulgar, so that he was even resented by his co-defendants. I never talked to him, but as you see him in the pictures, he looks like a little old man. But you have to contrast that with pictures of him in his glory, where he's barrel-chested, he has a uniform, he walks around with a whip, and boots, of course. It's amazing what happens to people when you take their boots away. They shrivel.
What about Ribbentrop?
Ribbentrop, not very assertive. One of the major criminals, he sat next to Hess, but I never talked to him.
Was your general impression as you looked out over the dock and you saw these 21 defendants, is they just kind of old guys at this point who've been stripped of their glory? And
Most of them, yeah. As I say, Goring was the only one who kept the stiff upper lip. Then there were others like von Papen, Schacht, and Fritsch, who were eventually acquitted, who also felt they had a chance of being acquitted because they weren't totally involved. They were also more educated and had a more aristocratic background, so that helped. All these factors which should be irrelevant if justice were blind are not.
is there a legacy to all of this Nuremberg experience that you had, not only to yourself personally, but
Oh, I think if you pick up a newspaper nowadays, it's very clear that there is a legacy. Not that everyone approves of all that happened at Nuremberg or all that didn't happen at Nuremberg, but Nuremberg fell into oblivion for about 10 years after. And then with, I forget exactly when it happened, but about 10, 15 years later, it became prominent again. Vietnam, because remember Bertrand Russell had a mock trial where we were the criminals. And since then, the genocide in Rwanda, in Bosnia, in Cambodia, this Nuremberg always comes up. And the subsequent trials in these places, South Africa also, it's a drop in the bucket. But as one Tutsi woman said in Rwanda, who had somehow gotten through it, was hidden by Hutus, she said there's no way to get at all these people. There's so much killing going on that even the children were killing children. I mean, you're talking, there was 500,000. Cambodia, they say 1.7 million. And then these last butchers in Iraq, some of the things they perpetrated on human beings. So it's not over, it's still there. And especially with Iraq, there's been a number of articles recently about potential trials. No one has said anything definite yet, but they're thinking about it. I think it's somewhat premature. It's also kind of risky because if Justice Jackson's interest in aggressive war is really that important, yeah, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, but some other people did some invading too, an aggressive war. I could say it's preemptive war, but, well, preventive war, but you better find what you're preventing.
Right. And you wonder whether you get lost in the semantics of it all.
Well, probably yes, because, again, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, that this, Kenneth Anderson points out that the Security Council has usurped that role. And we just slipped by with the English in Iraq and the Russians in Chechnya and Bosnia and the French in Francophone Africa and the Chinese in Tibet and Taiwan. So people do pretty much what they want.
Sure.
But I want you to know that at the end of my talk, I'm more upbeat than I'm being right now. As I say,
So we'll be there.
don't want you to give up on the world. It's up to you.
You're the successor. I think what I'd like to do, Brent, are you hungry though for a little lunch before you do your...
Oh, maybe a little bite. I'm not terribly hungry, but
Why don't we do this, Brent? Want to take my car, maybe just get Dr. Joseph a sandwich, then come back, and then I'm going to take you up on our way to Dunkirk. We'll take a slow ride, and I'll take you through Chautauqua Institution.
oh, great, great. I wanted to see that.
It's one of those days where it's
Yeah.
a good day to see Chautauqua. So, do you want to take them down to a Burger King, or maybe just a sandwich?
Fine, that's fine. Yeah, just so that my knees don't shake me.
I was just trying to think through. I bet you had breakfast, so did I.
Yeah.
And then we won't have a chance to eat until
Right.
after the event if you don't take away. I'll help her break down.
Can I have your keys then?
Sure. Because I was just thinking about that.